It's the 25th of February 1938, as several formations of Japanese A5M Claws of the 13th Air Group are about to fly over Nanchang Airfield. Seated in 2nd Platoon, 21-year-old airman Tetsuzō Iwamoto is about to receive his first taste of true combat in the Second Sino-Japanese War against the Chinese. Despite holding a commanding position in the air, the Japanese are met in number by the defending I-15 and 16 fighters from above. Without hesitation, Iwamoto proceeds to climb before quickly closing in on an unsuspecting I-15 biplane. With the enemy dead ahead, he lines up the target in his gun sights and pulls the trigger. Tetsuzō Iwamoto was born the 14th of June 1916 in Tomari Town, Karafuto Prefecture, now present-day Sakhalin in Russia. His father, a police officer, was later appointed chief of police in Sapporo, Hokkaido, which is where Iwamoto and his 3 siblings grew up, being the youngest of 3 sons, older only to his sister. Retiring in 1929, the family then moved to their father's hometown, Masuda, in Shimane Prefecture. Studying at the Masuda Agriculture and Forestry High School, Tetsuzō would graduate in 1934. Much to the dismay of his family, their 3rd son had initially looked to take a college entrance exam, but instead applied and subsequently passed the exams to join the air arm of the Japanese Navy. His father had wanted him to remain at home after the 1st son had moved away to a big city and the 2nd had sadly passed away. Despite this, he entered the aviation department with a letter that read, "I was born as the youngest child, so I will give my life for my country." In late 1935, he was assigned to the aircraft carrier Ryujo, where he served as a shipboard maintenance worker, but his aspirations to become a pilot grew ever stronger. On the 28th of April 1936, at the rank of Mechanic 2nd Class, Iwamoto began his flight training at the Imperial Navy Aeronautical Technology and Training Center on Lake Kasumigara. Established in 1921, this air base and flight school provided the essential training for naval pilots, including future ace of the 343rd Kokutai, Naoshi Kano. On the 1st of November that year, he was promoted to Mechanic 1st Class before graduating from the program and gaining another promotion to Airman 1st Class on the 26th of December. A further 6 months of advanced training took place with the Saiki Air Group before being transferred to the Omura Naval Air Group on the 16th of July 1937. The following year, on the 10th of February 1938, Iwamoto would be transferred once again, this time to the front lines in China to join the 13th Air Group. 15 days later, on that fateful day above the clouds of Nanchang, Tetsuzō would find himself right on the tail of the enemy.
機関銃から弾丸が心地よく吹き出し、快感が体を震わせた。初めてまともな標的と対峙した瞬間だった。敵機は突然機体から白煙を吹き出し、そして何の前触れもなく炎上。機体を包み込み、まるで火球のように空中に墜落した。発撃つい。しかし今にして思えば、それはほんの一瞬のことだった。発撃ついの喜びで血が騒いだ。気がつけば高度は4000メートルまでもとがっていた。
First combat over Chinese skies sees Iwamoto shoot down 4 enemy aircraft, one uncertain, all either I-15 or 16s, with the final kill being one attempting to land.
高度はわずかに100メートル。不意をつかれた敵機は驚いて足をもとろしたまま急旋回した。この高度では旋回は不可能。一瞬にして飛行場の端に頭から激突し、土煙を上げて飛散した。なんという刹那。これが戦闘機パイロットの宿命か。身の危険も忘れ、換気図に光敵を憐れみたくなった。5機目を撃ち落としたせいか、機体の前後左右から 高射砲弾が飛び交い、ハッとして現実に引き戻された。高度100メートルの上空で高射砲がひっきりなしに撃ちまくっている。心臓がドキドキして体が震えた。高度に1000メートルまで回復し、空核割れるかの交点の世界から静寂の世界へと戻った。間一髪で死を免れたのはまるで夢のようだった。徐々に生きている実感が湧いてきた。そして明日への希望が再び、いやむしろ新たに蘇ってきた。
On the 22nd of March 1938, the 13th Flying Group Fighter Squadron was merged with the 12th Fighter Squadron, where Type 96 carrier fighters of the 1st Chotai had their landing gear painted in red and were called the Red-Legged Squadron, while the 2nd Chotai had their gear painted in blue and were called the Blue-Leg Squadron. Commencing on his second flight, come the 29th of April 1938, subsequently Emperor's Day, followed with another air raid on Hanko, where Tetsuzō brawled and shot down a further 4 enemy aircraft, also surviving a 2v9 encounter with further enemy I-16s. For his actions that day, he would go on to receive the Commander's Award from Sekarahin Hisashi. 51 enemy planes were claimed as being shot down by the Japanese that day. At the end of May, the 13th Air Group were joined by 30 supporting fighters from carriers Kaga and Akagi. By the 14th of September 1938, Iwamoto had completed a total of 82 missions, gaining 14 aerial victories. Ordered to rejoin the Saiki Naval Air Corps, the place he had started his career as an airman, he returned to the mainland aboard the Imperial Japanese Navy hospital ship Murumaru. Tetsuzō would spend the next 2 years as an instructor with the Saiki Air Group in Kyushu. By June 1st, 1941, Iwamoto was a first-class flight sergeant, being a part of the fighter squadron aboard the carrier Zuho. By October 4th, the squadron was to be broken in two, with pilots being transferred to one of 2 larger aircraft carriers, the Zukaku and Shokaku. Now aboard the Zukaku, training began on June 20th at Omura Air Base, which included in-formation air combat, night navigation, and carrier landing on the more spacious deck of the Shokaku. As November approached, all available fighters, bombers, and carrier-based attack aircraft received a major overhaul, being modified in secret, day and night. Discipline within the unit was particularly strict, with warnings given to behavior when outside. All was in build-up and preparation for one of the most infamous attacks of World War II.
真珠湾奇襲攻撃の計画を聞いたとき、私の体は熱くなり、目は輝き、緊迫感を覚えました。艦内は緊張感に包まれ、戦闘前の静寂に包まれ、各部署は活気に満ち溢れていました。
Although Iwamoto's squadron was not directly used during the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Zukaku was part of the main task force, so he did witness the attack planes coming and going in the build-up to and after the raid. By Christmas Eve that year, the squadron returned to Oita Air Base before spending the new year on the mainland in Beppu, celebrating the achieved victory in Hawaii.
我が随閣中隊は装備の更新のため、鈴鹿基地の三菱航空機工場へ赴き、数機の航空機を受領し、実戦配備に向けた試験飛行や整備作業を行ったが、それ以外にやるべき仕事はなく、半ば休息状態のまま1942年を迎えた。次の作戦命令はまだ元されていない。即戦命令は増されていない。
But he didn't have to wait long, as on the 5th of January they were ordered to deploy to the Bismarck Archipelago, which was to see the Akagi, Kaga, Zukaku, and Shokaku entering the Truk Islands. The Japanese continued on their island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, with Kabyeng and Rabaul falling on the 21st of January. Other than some small raids from outdated American B-10 and 11 bombers, air combat remained minimal for Tetsuzō. Offensive air raids were conducted on Allied bases at Leh and Salamaua, which saw the 1st and 2nd Carrier Divisions bombing and strafing planes and hangars entirely unopposed. It wasn't long before they found themselves back at Truk, helping to escort the Chitose Air Group over to Rabaul. It was here that Iwamoto would briefly reunite with his fellow classmate, Petty Officer Yoshi, who he had not heard from since the Sino-Japanese War. Later renamed the 4th Air Group, they were the first to be established in Rabaul and will remain there until the very end of the war. In late January/early February, the carrier divisions returned to the mainland, docking at Yokosuka. 9th of February 1942, Iwamoto is ordered to travel by land to Suzuka Air Base, where new equipment was to be accepted and training would take place, arriving there on the 10th. 18th of February, new Model 32 Zeros are delivered from the Mitsubishi manufacturing plant, located behind where Tetsuzō's unit were located on the base, where test flights were then carried out by veteran pilots. Early March 1942, the new aircraft are deemed combat ready, with many of the younger carrier-based pilots receiving intense training in aerial combat, firing, and navigation. At around this time, Captain Saito, commander of Zukaku's fighter squadron, is replaced by Captain Kyokuma Okojima. The 7th of March saw both the Zukaku and Shokaku departing from Yokosuka, arriving at Celebes Island on the 24th, where they were joined by the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu of the main task force, including the battleships of the 3rd Squadron. 26th of March 1942, the Japanese task force plots a new heading to the Indian Ocean, arriving in early April. Commencing on the 5th of that month, orders are given to bomb Colombo, Ceylon, now present-day Sri Lanka. With a combined force of 180 aircraft, including 36 fighters, 54 dive bombers, and 90 level bombers, they took off at 9 a.m., heading 370 kilometers to the south. Tetsuzō was once again not a part of this attack force, but was assigned to watch and patrol the skies above the main fleet. Iwamoto's squadron were the first to take off, however no enemy planes were initially found while on patrol. As the rest of the fighters withdrew, Tetsuzō remained in the air, spotting a lonesome PBY Catalina. He ordered his wingmen to follow, using cloud cover to hide their plane's silhouette from the unaware Americans. When they were spotted, the Catalina attempted to speed away from the attackers while providing defensive fire, but it was to no use.
次の瞬間、機体は垂直に急行を戻し、長い煙の尾を引いた。海に墜落した瞬間、辺り一面が火の海と化した。機体を整列させ、低高度で基地へ帰還しようとしていた時、エンジンの異常な振動に気づき、緊急着陸した。点検の結果、おそらく2発目の被弾によるものと判断した。弾丸はプロペラを貫通し、エンジンシリンダーのヒートシンクを損傷した上で、私の目の前の照準器に命中したんだ。少しでも前後左右に体を傾けていれば、間違いなく頭部に命中していただろう。
25th of April 1942, reports reached the task force of the continued bombing campaign at Port Moresby in New Guinea and Port Darwin in Australia. 1st of May, the Zukaku Shokaku, accompanied by the destroyers Shigari, Yugari, Ariake, and Shiratsuyu, secretly depart from Truk and head south along the Solomon Islands, hoping to intercept the enemy task force that was thought to go after the planned invasion force at Port Moresby. 4th of May 1942, a US task force consisting of 2 large aircraft carriers, including the USS Yorktown and several battleships, launches a surprise attack on Tulangi in the Solomon Islands. This incident is considered the start of the Battle of the Coral Sea.
5月6日、レンネル島の北を通過し、ついに珊瑚海へ進撃した。交番上の全航空機は必要な準備を完了し、いつでも離陸できる体制を整えていた。しかし、その日も敵機動部隊を発見することはできなかった。
The next day, on the 7th, finally hailed successful recon reports of all available planes proceeded to take off, with Iwamoto leading 3rd Platoon. Despite following the provided vectors to target, no enemies could be found, and as the weather continued to worsen, the order was given to head back to the carriers. 20 minutes later, what appeared to be 2 warships down low were spotted and immediately bounced by the escorting Japanese bombers. Closer inspection of these ships eventually revealed them to be an enemy oil tanker and single destroyer, with the tanker suffering multiple hits, including a Kamikaze bomber strike after it was fatally hit during its descent towards the sea. The destroyer was hit by a single bomb as it limped away from the wreckage of the burning tanker.
この戦闘は 最終的には偵察機がタンカーを空母と誤認したことが原因でしたが、艦の勇敢な反撃、敵の投資、そして自爆した我が艦の悲惨な最後に私は深く感動しました。
The Japanese task force proceeded to head north, with all planes on standby that evening. Reports came in that the Americans had already detected their task force and were deploying fighters. This immediately halted a planned night attack by the Japanese bombers, as a friendly fighter formation consisting of all but the Zukaku attack force then returned to the carriers. All were riddled with bullet holes, a testament to the intense fighting that had taken place. Despite the damage, only a single aircraft was lost, and that night friendly seaplanes were launched by a nearby heavy cruiser, keeping tabs on the enemy's position until the early hours of the morning. As the sun began to rise on the 8th of May, morale aboard the Zukaku remained high, especially among the anti-aircraft crews who were eager to experience combat against enemy aircraft for the first time. Leading his butai once again at 9:30 a.m., Iwamoto took off and headed for an altitude of 7,500 meters above the carrier. It wasn't long before enemy squadrons were spotted at an altitude of around 5,500 to 6,000 meters, with fighter squadrons positioned some 300 meters higher as escorts. Breaking up into single columns, the enemy bombers moved into position to begin their dive on the Japanese carriers below.
太陽黒点は刻一刻と増加し、やがて巨大な雲のような群れを形成し、艦隊の上空に迫ってきた。敵戦闘機はグラマン FCF、艦載爆撃機は SBD ドーントレスだった。高高度から急行もとしようとしていた SBD 機への至近距離に 10mm 砲撃は迫力満点だった。一撃で最初の機は炎上し、煙をたなびかせながら急角度で落下した。続いて私は火を吹きながら2機目の敵機を攻撃した。
The sheer number of enemy planes was simply too much for Iwamoto's fighters to keep up with. However, their performance during the engagement had duly impressed the captain, flight commander, officers and maintenance personnel on the carriers below. As the first attack wave of enemy attacks subsided, the Zukaku remained intact. Further behind it though, a brawl was still ongoing between the remaining Zeros, Wildcats and Dauntlesses. Leaving 2nd Butai to continue protecting the task force at 5,000 meters, Iwamoto charged his squadron towards the battlefield, where he quickly found himself on the tail of another SBD.
私は追撃態勢を取り、ひたすら射撃を続けた。翼の付け根から黒い破片が飛び散り、同時に敵機は爆発し、翼は吹き飛ばされ、機体と搭乗員は一直線に海へと落ちていった。敵機は集結し、空母上空へと帰還した。燃料計を見るとガソリンが50リットルほどしか残っていないことに気づいた。空中戦が始まって以来、私は熱心に戦い続け、どれくらいの時間が経ったのかさえわからなかった。何が起こったのか全くわからなかった。
As a storm began to brew above the task force, Iwamoto took the risk of landing in heavy rain where visibility was next to nothing. During the battle, the Japanese fleet had been scattered slightly out of formation, so ditching in the rough seas below could equally spell his potential demise, given the much longer wait in the freezing cold depths for cruisers and destroyers to return to their designated vectors. Despite the dreadful conditions, he managed a successful landing for refueling and rearming.
行き着く間もなく、補給を終えたばかりの愛機に乗り込み、発艦命令を待った。その時、嵐の真っ只中から敵戦闘機側が空母を狙撃し、あっという間に姿を消した。実際、甲板上にいた味方機8機は一発も命中せず、煙突に十数個の弾痕を残しただけだった。
With the bridge giving the order to take off, the Zukaku squadron raced into the storm above, climbing up to an altitude of 6,000 meters once again. Spotting enemy dive bombers down low, Iwamoto could see that this strike force consisted of less planes than the first attack wave. They also appeared to be less organized, as the poor visibility in the storm made navigation towards the Japanese carriers difficult. At a strength of about 40 planes, it took mere minutes before 1/3 of the Dauntless bombers were shot down, with Tetsuzō choosing to save his ammunition and continuing his patrol of 4,000 meters for what he anticipated to be another attack wave incoming of torpedo bombers.
突然、元の昇格を見戻すと、 まるで飛行小判に被弾したかのように艦首と艦尾から黒と白の煙が出ているのが見えました。
The Shokaku had sustained enough damage that it became impossible to land on her, given the large hole in her flight deck, while other cruisers and destroyers had also been damaged by the dive bombers. Spotted some 5,000 meters away from Iwamoto's squadron and sitting at an altitude of just 1,000 meters, the now obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers were en route for the bruised task force.
私が反撃を開始した時、友軍艦隊はまだ7から8キロ離れていたので、数回にわたる繰り返し攻撃で敵艦隊の魚雷を発射させ、そのほとんどを撃墜することができました。
Returning to 4,000 meters and continuing the patrol, Tetsuzō soon realized once again that he only had a maximum of 40 minutes of fuel remaining. It was only after all Shukaku's aircraft had landed safely that Iwamoto's squadron followed suit. Once again, the Zukaku escort did not lose a single aircraft, with the battle being deemed a great victory by those on board. A total of 48 confirmed kills of combined US fighters and bombers, with 24 unconfirmed. Further reports had come in regarding friendly attacks on US carriers as the Battle of the Coral Sea concluded, with the USS Yorktown receiving heavy damage, while the USS Lexington was critically wounded and later had to be scuttled. Both airmen and crew aboard the Zukaku were now suffering from severe fatigue after such an intense battle. However, the main task force was still yet to return. With Iwamoto in charge, he chose 7 men to accompany him on yet another patrol to find and escort the remaining aircraft back to the fleet. Taking off for their third sortie of the day, they climbed to the familiar 4,000 meters in altitude. Within 20 minutes, a large group of aircraft was spotted on the horizon at around 1,000 meters, heading straight for the carriers.
すぐに警戒して近づき、確かに我が攻撃部隊の機関であることが分かった。出発時は100機近い編隊を組んでいたが、今見ると戦闘機のほとんどは残っていたものの、艦載攻撃機は十数機、艦載爆撃機は20機にも満たない。おそらく攻撃部隊の半数近くが自決し、帰還していないのだろう。大勝利を収めたにもかかわらず、私は言い表せないほどの孤独感を覚え、涙が溢れてきた。しかしこれは戦争だ。我々は最前線の戦士だ。常にこのような事態に備えている。
On paper, the damage dealt to both ships and aircraft favored the Japanese, but the Battle of the Coral Sea is today seen as a much greater strategic victory for the US. The loss of full air cover for the planned invasion of Port Moresby meant that Imperial High Command were forced to call off the operation, actions that would have a much greater knock-on effect to proceedings later in the war. For Iwamoto, this was his first experience of observing large-scale losses during battle, something he continued to wrestle with into the early hours of that night.
艦隊は大勝利を収め、トラック島への帰路に着いた。その夜以来、静まり返った船室の空気は何とも言えない重苦しさに包まれていた。戦友の姿が鮮やかに浮かび、まるでまだ生きていて話しかけてくれているような気がする。しかしもう彼らはいない。寂しさで胸が締め付けられる。涙がこみ上げてくる。太平洋戦争、いや日中戦争以来、幾多の戦闘に参加してきたが、これほど多くの戦友を一度に撃ったのは初めてだ。なかなか実感が湧かない。確かに多くの命を犠牲にして敵空母を撃沈した。戦死した戦友たちはきっと満足して死んでいったのだろう。しかしこれで本当に良かったのだろうか。
Soon both carriers plotted a course back to mainland Japan, with the Zukaku landing at Kanoya on the 21st of May 1942. With the attack force now reduced to just 30 fighting aircraft and the Shokaku remaining in port for repairs, Tetsuzō's squadron returned to Mitsubishi Works in Suzuka to receive new aircraft, conduct flight tests, and further training for younger crew members. By mid-June, the 5th Carrier Division was suddenly transferred to a carrier in the Inland Sea before heading to the fleet anchorage point at Hashira Island, located roughly 20 miles south of the naval base at Kure, Hiroshima. Aboard the ship, rumors began to spread that 4 aircraft carriers from the 1st and 2nd Divisions had been sunk by the American task force off the coast of Midway. On the 14th of June, the combined fleet, led by the battleships Yamato and Musashi, entered Hashirajima port. The larger carriers remained to be seen, visually confirming the loss of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, with only the smaller older carrier Hosho returning. In retaliation for their crushing defeat at Midway, the Japanese ordered an attack on Dutch Harbor in the Amanak Island, an archipelago connected to mainland Alaska. The Battle of Dutch Harbor was led by the 4th Air Fleet, consisting of its 2 carriers, the Ryujo and Junyo, along with 2 heavy cruisers, Takeo and Maya, and 3 destroyers. In typical fashion up to this point, the Japanese would go on to win the initial battle through heavy bombing, but in the long run would lose the overall Aleutian Islands campaign that followed, with the US eventually recapturing both the islands of Attu and Kiska before forcing a Japanese evacuation. The 15th of June would see the Zukaku embark on a crusade over to the Aleutian Islands to support the attack, arriving not long before the end of that month. Being the only combat-ready large carrier in the fleet, the Zukaku was tamely given guard duty throughout the entire operation, being escorted by the 2 heavy cruisers, Miyoko and Haguro, including several other destroyers. For Iwamoto, action here was fairly limited. As the operation came to a close, he headed back to the mainland with his squadron in mid-July 1942.
佐伯基地では再編が行われ、兵士たちは朝から晩まで連日厳しい訓練に励み、技能の向上に努めた。しかし、彼らには経験不足があった。
But Tetsuzō was not. He was now one of the Navy's most experienced and capable fighter pilots, having racked up almost 30 aerial victories total so far. At the end of July, Iwamoto was to be tasked with putting that experience to good use for the betterment of future Japanese pilots.
7月30日、私は岡島隊員に呼び出されました。大村基地に転属し、搭乗員の訓練を担当するよう要請されました。私は何度も断りました。搭乗員の訓練が緊急に必要であることは理解していました。しかし、前線に行けなかったことへの後悔は残っており、去るのは寂しかったです。私自身、日清戦争以来、最前線搭乗員として戦場で戦ってきたことを誇りに思っていました。しかし、最終的には岡島隊員に説得されました。私も決心しました。戦争に勝たなければなりません。勝つためには、熟練した搭乗員を迅速に育成しなければなりません。そのためには、個人的な名誉など一切捨てなければならないという当然の決断をもとしました。
As the war pushed on into August 1942, Japan's continued small successes of victories across the Pacific had left the nation with victory disease. Described by Iwamoto while stationed at Omura Air Base, it was something that often preceded the state of defeat.
敵軍らがだるかなる島とつらぎ島に上陸したという知らせが本土に届いた時でさえ、ミッドウェー海戦の敗戦を知らない国民は、我が空軍が敵機を全て海に撃ち落とすだろうと確信し、勝利ムードが続いていた。しかし、状況を知る我々は楽観視できない。半年前なら可能だったかもしれないが、今や主隻の空母とその乗組員の大半を撃った。仮に本土で訓練中の残存空母部隊を投入したとしても、互角に戦えるだろうか。降臨、苦戦を強いられるだろう。
The fact was, the navy and logistics for the empire's continued expansion had reached a tipping point, one which it would ultimately never recover from. November 2nd, 1942, Tetsuzō is ordered to transfer from Omura Air Base to Yokosuka, before then serving as a teacher at the Opama Naval Air Corps, taking a period of rest at the mainland until March 1943. By this time, the Guadalcanal campaign had formally ended, with the Americans now permanently holding the area. 2nd of March 1943, Iwamoto then receives orders to transfer to the newly formed 281st Kokutai, whose aims were to launch a counterattack against the Americans in the northern Aleutian Islands. 3rd of March 1943, arriving at the Tateyama Air Group, Chief Petty Officer Iwamoto begins preparations for further training of the air group in the nearby barracks, but it would be the stretch of logistics that once again would let the unit down. Delays in the arrival of the aircraft carrier that was to transport the 281st to the front line meant Japan could only rely on ground forces, who were quickly overrun as the island fell without sustained air support. By the time Iwamoto's Kokutai did arrive as intended, troops were already being withdrawn to Paramushia Island from Kiska. For the 281st, anti-submarine patrols became a regular occurrence towards the end of August, as poor weather subsided any aerial engagements with the enemy. Upon arriving on Paramushia Island, Tetsuzō and other off-duty airmen spent most of their time fishing in a nearby river that housed hundreds of spawning salmon and trout.
翌日、私たちは技術部に行き、12本の槍刀身を作り、基盤のメンバー全員が私の指示のもと、自給自足の名のもとに漁に出ました。8月元旬から9月中旬にかけて、私はほぼ毎日釣りをしていました。退屈なはずなのに、毎日が楽しかったのです。
As the colder months approached, the question of whether the squadron would remain on the island through the coming winter arose. As their planes were not equipped to deal with the severe cold, which in turn meant operations couldn't be carried out, they returned to the mainland until the following spring of 1944. Returning to his beloved Tateyama Air Base in Chiba Prefecture, Tetsuzō would be one of several airmen chosen to be dispatched to Rabaul, as this was in response to an unprecedented build-up of American forces in the Guadalcanal area. Departing on the 10th of November 1943, the 281st Air Group were to undertake a daring 2,800-mile-long journey in the now outdated Zero Fighter Model 21. The course would see them fly from Iwo Jima to Tinian Island, then onto Truk, and finally Rabaul itself. With the majority of the flight taking place over ocean, engine trouble here would make survival highly unlikely. What's worse, if they were to run into enemy aircraft along the way, Iwamoto was the only one with actual combat experience. Despite the harrowing journey, it was made successfully by all involved without incident.
船団のエンジンはどれも良好な状態だった。正午前、予定通り、遥か前方西島のシルエットが見えてきた。約2年前、空母随角から出撃し、哨戒を開始した際に見慣れた山々が目に入った。紛れもなく、ニューブリテンターだった。
It wouldn't be until a week later on the 17th of November that the 281st Kokutai would see its first bout of action. The Americans had quickly landed and established an airfield at Cape Torokina on the west coast of Bougainville. With clear skies and flying the Model 21-0 once again, they climbed to an altitude of 8,000 meters, with Iwamoto taking up the rearmost position of the Rabaul Air Group, consisting of the 201st, 204th, 253rd, 281st, and 701st Kokutai.
後方で見張りをしていた時、閃光が見えました。それは P さん18の命中弾でした。春田中隊の小林の乗った飛行機は上空からこの閃光に直撃され、たちまち炎上して墜落しました。
Above the current altitude, the performance of this particular Zero model would begin to struggle, so Iwamoto proceeded to nose down and drop his squadron to 6,000 meters. All but 2 enemy lightnings remained in the area as he quickly began to tail them.
私は右後ろ方の2機に攻撃を仕掛けた。敵機は反撃する気配もなく、元の基地へ逃げようとしていた。私は彼らを追撃し、側面と後方から発砲した。すると、強烈な衝撃を感じた。彼は頭をもとげ、地面に墜落した。
Further down at 4,000 meters, a large furball had erupted above the newly constructed American airfield. This would be Tetsuzō's first encounter with the new F-4U Corsair, shooting down one in the process. Observing 4 friendly aircraft nearby going up against 16 enemy fighters at an altitude of 3,000 meters, Iwamoto charged into the oncoming brawl, bagging himself the second victory of the day.
元下しようとしていた敵機に追いつき、50メートルほどの真後ろから追跡して発砲した。敵機はよろめき、気がつくとそのまま同じ姿勢で急行元を続けていたが、私はそれを見ている暇がなかった。
His second kill was later confirmed by his escort, as it was observed maintaining the same position as it crashed into the ground on the coastline, bursting into flames. As the battle began to fizzle out, Iwamoto spotted 40 enemy aircraft approaching at about 4,000 to 5,000 meters, blocking their means of retreat.
素早く決断し、私は沖合を航行する敵艦に発砲し、機首を向けた。敵艦が反撃に出る中、私は90度旋回して海上を駆け抜け、急行元と機銃掃射を続けた。約10分間の闘争の後、後方に敵機がいないのを確認し、ようやく安堵のため息をついた。
For their first engagement, the 281st Kokutai had fought well, achieving a result of shooting down 2 P-38 Lightnings, 8 F-4Us, along with 5 undetermined aircraft. Rabaul's air group commander was inexperienced, however, and Tetsuzō was quick to make note of this, given that barely half of the entire unit's strength was actually engaged in combat that day. Even so, the next few days were spent roasting in the heat of the tropical day and cooling off at night. On the morning of the 20th of November, Iwamoto was first to take off after reports came in of an incoming bomber formation. With most of the enemy fighter escorts being out of combat range of his A6M3 Model 22-0, Tetsuzō decided to climb down from higher altitude and head for the enemy's planned retreat route, which would pay extreme dividends to his kill tally.
私は元方を退却する敵機軍に突入した。雲の影を利用して奇襲を仕掛け、数回の攻撃で6機を撃墜した。おそ、いまります通してようたとおです。なりますを、いるの退却する敵機軍に突入した。雲の元の空間を利用し、高度約100メートルで、あらゆる角度から S に BC ヘルダイバーへの接近戦を続け、ほぼ全機を海中に叩き落とした。
The day concluded with a total of 52 enemy aircraft downed, with 17 unconfirmed. For Tetsuzō, he scored 7, bagging 2 consolidated P-30s, 2 P-38s, and 3 Helldivers. By the 21st of November, the 281st were separated from the main unit and reassigned to the 201st Kokutai. That afternoon, further engagements with enemy B-24 bombers gave little success, ending in a brawl that saw Iwamoto lucky to escape after taking down a single Liberator. 1 week later, on the 28th, the Japanese ace bagged himself another bomber, this time a B-25 Mitchell. On December 4th, a plan was hatched to go after American fighters who persisted in remaining at high altitude during US bomber raids on Rabaul. These fighters were particularly crafty in how they would wait for the ensuing furball to end down low before jumping in on the remaining Japanese aircraft that had survived the brawl and were looking to land. The period of time directly after a large engagement has taken place is when any pilot is at their most vulnerable, when the supposed threat has passed, the adrenaline has worn off, and you begin to think about returning to base and landing. Along with 3 other veteran pilots, Tetsuzō took off and climbed to 10,000 meters, watching the usual air battle ensue below. As suspected, cruising at 7,000 meters appeared 6 faint black dots in the distance. These were indeed the aircraft they were looking for, the F-4U Corsairs. Unknown to the Americans, who were focused on the potential targets below, Iwamoto and his squadron were charging in for the kill.
戦闘機に忍び寄る狼たちを追いかけた。敵の背後に迫り、10メートルまで迫った。もはや狙いを定める必要はなく、一撃で仕留める覚悟で引き金を引いた。両翼から飛び出す 20mm 弾の威力。何発も撃ち込まれたかのようで、敵機の胴体中央に命中し、機体は真っ二つに砕け散った。
Dropping down to an altitude of 6,000 meters, 2 further Corsairs were shot down by Iwamoto's wingmen before the rest scarpered for home. If not for the enemy's superior aircraft performance, the result could have been much worse for the Americans. 7th of December 1943, Yokosuka Aviation Technical Arsenal delivered the Type 3 bomb from the mainland to Rabaul. This munition was a 30-kilogram white phosphorus anti-aircraft bomb, with the Zero able to hold 2 maximum, 1 under each wing. 9th of December 1943, Iwamoto is chosen to test this new bomb during an intercept mission where he observes the smoke-like octopus tentacles remaining in the sky above the enemy after detonation. Despite not seeing any downed aircraft from the explosion himself, a nearby enemy garrison claims to observe 30 enemy aircraft dropping from the sky. Tetsuzō is awarded these claims as aerial victories, but he formally rejects them. 10th of December, not long after taking off on another intercept mission, Iwamoto's beloved Zero, now covered in many cherry blossom markings, began to experience engine trouble. Despite taking intense fire from 4 F4Us, the ace manages to evade his pursuers at the cost of heavy damage to the left fuel tank, with the area behind his seat being riddled with holes. Even with a damaged aircraft, Tetsuzō was able to score 6 further victories in 2 Corsairs and 4 stocky bombers, most likely either SPD Dauntlesses or TBF Avengers. At 2,000 meters of altitude, his engine finally gave up as the fuel pressure gauge dropped to 0, forcing him to glide down to the friendly airfield below. The inspection of his aircraft left him horrified at such a reckless performance.
整備班の調査によると、私の機体には167個の銃弾の穴があり、そのうち6個は座席の内側にありました。マリマリの私が持ち込んだ弾丸は全て 12.7mm 弾で、そのうち2個は鋼鉄製の座席の背もたれにとどまっていました。ハーネスを調べると、案の定ハーネスの金具に2つの傷を見つけました。この金具が私の命を救ってくれたのです。機体は修理不能となり、60箇所以上の撃墜跡が刻まれた哀機についに別れを告げなければなりませんでした。
After his dance with death, Iwamoto was grounded after falling ill with malaria and dengue fever. He would spend the next week resting as the American raiding parties from the air persisted. On the morning of the 17th of December 1943, after such a brief recovery, he took off once more in pursuit of nearby bombers who were passing overhead. Climbing to the accustomed 9,000 meters, he noticed a gap between the B-25s below and their fighter escorts, and so pounced at the opportunity to regain his aerial prowess after what felt like such a long time away from combat. Aiming for the last bomber in the formation, he charged in alone.
B-25 はすぐに私の攻撃に気づき、集中砲火を浴びせてきた。私は気にせず、砲火の中を飛び込み、50メートルまで接近した。思う存分狙いを定め、自信を持って発砲した。すると B-25 はたちまちガソリンの煙を吹き出し、炎を上げて空中に舞い上がり、ラバウル湾へ床を描いて墜落した。
It would take the downing of yet another B-25 before the American fighter escorts picked up on Iwamoto's movements, by which point he decided it was best to turn tail and run for home. This decision would once again save his life, as his return to base was plagued by bouts of dizziness, to which he surmised might be down to anemia.
離陸した飛行機は全部戻ってきて、列をなしていたようでした。着陸してほっとした矢先、またもや貧血になり、目の前が真っ暗になり、気を失いました。
By the time Tetsuzō regained consciousness, he was back in his bunk at the command post, where he received a scolding from the military surgeon. That evening, a slight fever returned, forcing the ace to remain grounded the next day, much to his own dismay. As the end of 1943 approached, the strain of consistent daily combat was starting to show. The 201st Kokutai had been disbanded in mid-December due to suffering such heavy losses, with all remaining aircraft being transferred to the 204th.
私たちの生活は無意味で、敵が近づくと機械的に飛び上がり、去ると降りるだけだった。ただ同じサイクルを繰り返していた。もう娯楽への欲求はなかった。同僚が死ぬことなどどうでもいい。考えるのは自分がいつ死ぬかということだけだった。
Christmas Day 1943 soon came and went. For the Americans, the gift of combat just kept on giving, as older P-30 and 40 aircraft were quickly being replaced by the new F-4U Corsairs and F-6F Hellcats. Their strength in number grew with each raid too, 50, 70, sometimes over 100 aircraft attacking over a ball at once. New Year's Day brought with it 3 days of rest for the Japanese, but faith in command was clearly beginning to wane.
将来にかける上層部の戦略を信じるのが難しくなってきている。年明けの地、欠員補充のため本土から和解の陸民員が何人か連れてこられたが、 彼らの訓練はあまりにも不十分で、私は密かに彼らが死ぬために来たのではないかと疑っていた。実際、着任から数日のうちに彼らの多くが戦死した。
For the next 8 days, Tetsuzō would once again face a daily battle to the death above the skies of Rabaul, as by the 12th of January 1944, his squadron had taken part in 17 sorties. By this point, Iwamoto's plane was once again decorated by nearly 40 cherry blossom markings as he racked up further kills on 6 Corsairs, 8 Dauntless dive bombers, and 2 of the new F-6F Hellcats. With Japanese commanders being withdrawn to the rear of Truk Island, those remaining in Rabaul were to be transferred to the 253rd Kokutai, operating at Taubera Air Base. Being one of the few remaining veterans, Tetsuzō was entrusted with leading the new recruits of the 253rd. By the morning of the 14th of January, all aircraft and personnel had completed the transfer, with all fighter operations now taking place from Taubera. At 8 a.m, the alarm signal came from the command post as Iwamoto took off and climbed to his aircraft's max capacity of 10,000 meters. Inbound was some 50 to 60 enemy aircraft, matched by the 40 or so Japanese that were still getting airborne. Luckily for the new recruits, only about 16 of these were fighters, the rest being dive bombers. As the Americans hovered over Taubera airfield, Iwamoto remained poised over his target, ready to strike. Shocked by the sudden large presence of Navy fighters, the American Hellcats that took note of the incoming threat fled out to sea at high speed, leaving the remaining aircraft to the mercy of the jungle below. In all, the squadron claimed 36 aerial victories in the engagement, with Tetsuzō nabbing 1 F-6F, 2 SPDs, with a further 2 uncertain. As US intelligence caught up on the fighter squadron's shift to Taubera from Rabaul, the show of force was on full display the next morning at 11 a.m. 3 huge formations consisting of 30 B-24s with 18 fighters, 18 B-25s with another 18 fighters, and around 100 SPD dive bombers and fighters approached the 2 Japanese airfields at 7,000 meters. Knowing they were totally outnumbered, both sides fought cautiously as the Americans released their bomb loads and left the combat area without being pursued. Iwamoto, understanding the situation, deliberately avoided direct aerial combat, instead sticking to his duties of flying top cover and ensuring the safety of his colleagues below. That evening, celebratory drinks were held for the first time in a while at the company barracks. Roughly 3 days before the shift over to Taubera, 80 carrier-based fighter planes were moved to Rabaul, which had provided a slight boost to morale. But Tetsuzō still felt uneasy. The Americans too were riding high on recent victories, and combined with the growing familiarity of the 253rd Kokutai's aircraft performance and tactics, it made for a recipe that left the boost of additional friendly aircraft short-lived. For Iwamoto, inebriation appeared to make those feelings boil over.
小隊長と一緒に総長室へ行き、久しぶりにラム酒を飲んだ。酒には強いので、全部飲み干してしまった。飲み会の最中、部隊から特務中尉が文句を言いに来たので、どうやら殴ってしまったらしい。というのも、その時すでに私は大柄な虎だったから、その記憶は全くないのだ。どうやら、元特殊部隊の隊長も殴ったらしい。もちろん、余計に寄っていたから、感心しなかったのは言うまでもない。
Rabaul's fighting Tiger was reported for both incidents, but neither case resulted in any repercussions. It seemed all for the betterment of the squadron, as within the space of the next 2 days, the 253rd suffered the loss of their 2 highest scoring aces behind Tetsuzō, that of Petty Officer Hagira and Shimizu. Only Sergeant Nishikane remained as Iwamoto's comrade from the 281st, but respite eventually followed, however, as US aerial forces were not seen again until early February, by which time Tetsuzō's plane was once again covered in 60 cherry blossom marks, though due to engine trouble he would be separated from his beloved Zero once more. February 6, 1944. At around 10 p.m, 4 American destroyers positioned just off the coast of Kokupo open on Japanese positions as their lack of night fighting capabilities in the air are revealed. Disheartened and angry at the potential humiliation of the air group for their lack of force, Iwamoto volunteers to go out and retaliate, once again alone. Carrying two 60-kilogram bombs under each wing, he speeds off towards the sound and flashes of the enemy guns. His two bombs miss their target, but continued strafing does cause small fires aboard 3 of the 4 vessels, forcing them out to sea. The Americans return in kind the next day with early morning bombings of the airfield, including the drop of parachute bombs. February 14th. Several days of intense fighting ensues between US Army and Navy squadrons against the Rabaul air group. Tetsuzō takes command of multiple sorties, strategically using hit-and-run tactics in order to minimize potential losses. Gaining several TBF, F6F and SPD victories along the way, the ace knows that it is pointless to risk the manpower available against such unfavorable odds. Well-timed attacks, followed by a swift retreat to draw in any eager American pilots, becomes a staple of the air group's maneuvers, having been devised by Iwamoto. On one day alone, the 253rd Kokutai claimed 21 Dauntlesses and 19 Corsairs shot down.
本日のような継続的な敵の攻撃では、飛行隊長が慎重な判断を怠れば、着陸時に敵の攻撃を受けたり、空中戦中に燃料や弾薬が尽きたりして、飛行隊が壊滅する悲劇に見舞われる可能性があります。しかし、今回のように 2,3 日も波状攻撃を受け続ければ、我々は心身ともに疲弊しきってしまうでしょう。
Late February 1944 would continue to bring with it more raids, with American firepower easily pushing into the 200s per sortie. One afternoon encounter near Kokupo saw the intercept of 2 Martin PBM flying boats escorted by 12 Wildcats, with all 4 Japanese squadrons launching sweeper attacks from a high altitude. 8 of the 12 F4Fs were shot down as the PBMs were mortally hit in the belly and forced to land in the sea before eventually being set on fire by further strafing from the 253rd. Another incident occurred the following day. After landing from a successful sortie, Iwamoto was caught in the middle of a B-24 raid, which saw him diving into a nearby shell hole on the airfield. Barely 50 meters away, a bomb exploded, showering him in mud as the depth of the hole ended up saving him from the blast. On both the 17th and 18th of February, Operation Hailstorm is commenced by US carrier divisions against Truk Atoll. All the while, Japanese newspapers, radio stations, and military leadership continues to spread false information concerning the state of the war effort, claiming that they will annihilate the enemy in one fell swoop, much to the annoyance of those fighting on the ground and in the air.
戦争の勝敗を最もよく知っているのは、軍の指導者や司令官ではなく、日々生き残りをかけて戦っている私たちです。昨年まではまだ希望に満ちたやりがいのある戦いでした。しかし今は戦士として臆病者になりたくないという一心から戦っていると言えるでしょう。
On the evening of the 19th, under orders of secrecy, Tetsuzō is told to collect his belongings and get ready for what will supposedly be a temporary transfer over to Truk as a response to the American attack. Suddenly parting with the ground crews, maintenance staff and other personnel who had kept the Rabaul air group flying all this time was emotionally difficult for all parties involved, as deep down those leaving knew that they would most likely never return to save the day.
さようなら、ラバウル。そして、おそらく二度と来ないだろう。何百人もの仲間が命を落としたラバウルの空に、永遠の別れを告げる時が来た。明日から、私たちはもう、ラバウル航空隊と呼ばれることはない。あの楽団の歌が、頭に浮かぶ。さようならラバウル。また来る日まで、しばし、別れの涙を流した。今度来る時は市電に乗ろう。さあ来たぞ。この愛機を見てくれ。
Much to the relief of the Army and Navy garrisons at Truk, the 253rd Kokutai, along with members of the 1st Air Fleet, left Rabaul and arrived safely on the island some 4.5 hours after takeoff. The state of the base after the American bombardment meant that further time had to be spent on rebuilding the command post and replenishing the area with further supplies and personnel from the mainland. With new recruits entering the front line with barely 100 hours of flight time, intensive training also had to be hurried along. In comparison, Iwamoto had been flying for the last 10 years, racking up 8,000 hours of flight time with 13,400 takeoffs and landings. By mid-March, the 253rd had been reorganized and transferred to the 307th Fighter Squadron. Storms became commonplace in the atoll, making patrols difficult, though initial sorties mostly consisted of hunting for submarines that had been attacking Japanese supply ships inbound for Truk. The remainder of the month was not devoid of action, however, as constant day and nighttime bombing from B-24 Liberators eventually saw Tetsuzō leading Type 3 bomb strikes against the cumbersome Americans. Despite their short successes, one sortie saw the loss of 19 aircraft at the command of Captain Hirano, who hadn't fired a single shot during the battle. This reduced Truk's total fighter capacity by more than half, down to just 17 planes. 29th of March 1944, in the early hours over Ora Island, approximately 40 minutes flight time from Truk, the 307th strike down a Martin PBM flying boat. Just after midday, the squadron returned to base, where they are greeted by a further raid by SPD dive bombers with Hellcat escorts. All 8 US fighters are shot down in response. 14th of April 1944, Base Command on Truk receives a reshuffle, with both Colonel Shibata and Lieutenant Haruta being transferred to mainland units, leaving Iwamoto and Nishikane as the remaining 2 personnel from the days of the 281st. 22nd of April 1944, on the north coast of New Guinea, Allied forces land at Harlandia. In response, the 1st Air Fleet moves the majority of its aircraft from Tinian Air Base to the Palau Islands. 1 month later, on the 27th, further enemy landings would then see aircraft being deployed to Peleliu to prevent further continued advances towards the Philippines, with both Saipan and Tinian being left virtually empty besides a few aircraft in maintenance. 14th of June 1944. Since their transfer from Rabaul, the remaining veteran pilots had not received a single new aircraft from supply, as existing damaged aircraft had simply been repaired and reused over and over again. With less than 1/3 of their crew remaining, headquarters decides to transfer Iwamoto, Nishikane, Shirashita, and 4 others to the mainland to replenish their equipment, boarding a Type 1 land-based attack aircraft bound for Japan.
昨年10月、立山を出発しラバウルへ進軍した時、最後に本土を見る覚悟をしていたが、今となっては生きて帰れると思うと嘘のようだ。オラナミヤナ、モースカイタユ。白い波一つない穏やかな海を一路手に安装へ飛び、夕方には無事に到着した。
The pilot of the aircraft transporting the veterans had intended for them to stay overnight before heading to Kisarazu the next morning, but Iwamoto's insistence saw to it that they were to fly through the night to reach Japan by the morning. This would once again end up being an incredibly lucky decision. The 7-hour flight was made without incident, as the crew were welcomed back home with a full view of Mount Fuji before landing at the base at 7 a.m. After a night off, Iwamoto and his unit received news the next morning that the American task force had indeed attacked Saipan with all its might, as battleships and heavy cruisers bombarded the island before a large landing fleet broke ground.
サイパン島が陥落すれば、広大なテニアン基地はたちまち敵の大型航空機の拠点となり、日本本土全域がその作戦半径内にいることになる。決戦部隊は何をしているのだろうか。一昨日手に暗島に止まっていたらどうなっていただろうか。幸いにも間一髪で難を逃れた。
The question was what to do next. With most of the air fleet advancing south, Tetsuzō's unit held no connection to crucial upcoming battles.
城本中尉と相談した後、トラック島に問い合わせたところ、予定通り新早々を受け取り、当面は木更津で待機するとの回答を得た。
The following day was spent testing the new equipment at Nakajima Aircraft Factory in Ota. However, as the situation began to worsen in Saipan and Tinian, the order to return to the front line took a lot longer to come in. On the 19th of June 1944, while returning to Tateyama to reminisce about his time with the 281st Air Group and enjoy the hospitality of his favorite restaurant in geishas, tragic news struck. The USS Kavala, a Gato-class submarine, had fatally torpedoed the combined fleet's main aircraft carrier, Shokoku, sinking her in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Along with losing the newer, larger carrier Taiho off the coast of Saipan, the Mariana Islands fell into American hands. For Iwamoto, this would spell the end of his campaign overseas, as the task of defending the mainland began to conjure into existence.
6月元旬、私たち7人は日本での任務を命じられました。白本中尉は矢田部、航空隊の訓練部隊。私は第3百造銃に航空隊。西県兵曹は第3 108戦闘飛行隊に配属され、私たちはそれぞれ別々に行動することになります。私の荷物のほとんどはトラック基地に残っていますが、戦況を考えると、もうトラック5を踏むことはないでしょう。
After completing formalities and saying his final goodbyes to his comrades at the 1st Air Fleet headquarters in Katori, Tetsuzō proceeded to board a train to Iwakunai, where the 332nd were stationed, once again, alone. But despite this separation, he would be greeted at the airbase by old faces, including his former commander, Colonel Shibata, and former commander of the 204th Kokutai in Rabaul, now a Major, Ito. Given his intense wealth of frontline experience in combat, Iwamoto was held in very high regard by his colleagues, and so it fell to him to assess the combat readiness of the unit as a whole during intensive training. Prince Takamatsu, the brother of Emperor Hirohito, was a Naval Academy instructor at the time. Being a classmate of Shibata, he would regularly visit the airfield almost every day. The 332nd was where Tetsuzō would first fly the J2M, though it left little to be admired compared to his favorite A6M.
ここで初めて雷電を操縦しました。確かにスピードはありましたが、機体が重く、特に操縦性が悪かったので、あまり意味がないと思っていました。大型機を攻撃したいならゼロ戦が必要でしょう。
Having spent 2 months with the 332nd, new transfer orders arrived in mid-August 1944. Iwamoto's new posting would be with the 316th Fighter Squadron in Mobara, back over in Chiba Prefecture near Tokyo. The commander of the 332nd had attempted to negotiate with the personnel department over the phone to have the move cancelled, but the 252nd Air Group, undergoing training there, was in desperate need of veteran pilots. Flying from Iwakunai to Haneda and spending a night in Tokyo, Tetsuzō would arrive at Mobara Air Base the following day. The reason for Iwamoto's transfer quickly became clear, as he soon discovered his squad leader at the 252nd to be none other than Captain Haruta, a fellow veteran from the 281st. Likewise, Lieutenant Colonel Yagi was also present, another squad lead from the time of the Omura Air Group. Just as he had done with the 332nd, Tetsuzō would spend the next 2 months organizing and training the 252nd, all to be ready in time for future deployment. It was a frustrating time for the Tiger Ace, as the imperial capital was being regularly hit by B-29 raids that saw little in the way of matched firepower. Important factories being hit one by one, all the while he remained stuck on the ground, only able to continue training hard every day. By October 10th, 1944, the US task force had advanced as far as Taiwan, Ishigaki Island and Okinawa, which finally spurred the unit's call to arms as orders came down advancing them to Kokubu Base in Kagoshima. By the 12th, the Joint Army and Navy ragtag group of 600 aircraft had moved to Lejima Island in Okinawa. At precisely 11 AM, the order was given to sortie as each unit took off, circled the island once, before heading in the direction of the enemy task force. Heavy cloud throughout the journey caused their already shaky formation to become disjointed. After around 2.5 hours, drop tanks were released before several small black dots were spotted up ahead. Below, Iwamoto observed a squadron of Nakajima B6N Tenzan torpedo bombers, as to the left of them, just above the clouds, were the enemy fighters.
元方の友軍機が危険にさらされていた。レバーを全開にし、黒天軍に向かって突撃した。しかし、手遅れだった。敵機はすでに元方の天山隊への攻撃を開始していたのだ。追いついた時には、3機の天山隊はすでに炎上し、海へと墜落していた。敵は8機の F6F 機群だった。上空からの攻撃を察知した F6F 機は前方の雲の中へと姿を消した。
Initially abandoning the battle, Tetsuzō entered the clouds cautiously. 30 minutes of searching later, and the 8 Japanese Zeros were awarded with a group of returning SBD dive bombers. Immediately attacking the planes in front, Iwamoto pounced on one of the bombers, shooting it down in a scorch of flames. The rest of his company soon followed suit.
敵機は突然の攻撃に驚愕し、各機拍車チアが戸元に飛び込んでいった。しかし、私の後を追う機が攻撃を仕掛け、さらに2機が炎を上げて雲の元に墜落した。この雲の上元には敵戦闘機が潜んでいたのだろう。待ち伏せの危険を感じ、私は雲の中に避難した。
Heading in the direction of Taiwan and running on no more than 30 minutes of remaining fuel, the 316th eventually spotted the shadowy mountains of the island. Further north, the decision was made to land at Kyushu, but upon arrival, the airfield was littered with bomb craters, overturned friendly aircraft, and an air arsenal building that was on fire. Despite the obstacles, though, all aircraft landed safely. The following morning, the Zeros returned to Tainan, meeting up with Captain Haruta and his crew along the way. Their flight en route had seen no action at all, and so they were very surprised to hear of the Tiger's run-in with the enemy. With weather conditions still poor, Iwamoto's squadron volunteered to take the initiative as they looked to depart Tainan and meet up with the main attack force over Hualien port. With enemy forces less than 2 hours away from Taiwan, fighting was inevitable. With their squadron bringing up the rear, the attack force headed out to sea. Heavy clouds once again lay scattered on both sides of the formation, and it wasn't long before they ran into enemy aircraft.
突然、前方元方に飛行機らしきものが見えた。慎重に近づくと、敵の F6F だった。雲間から次々と現れ、上昇してきた。大隊やった。敵の戦闘機は、すでに前線戦闘機体に向かって元下している。危険だ。私は敵を追跡し、まだ気づいていない味方機に機関銃を撃ち込んだ。
Luckily for the attack force, the 316th Kokutai's advantageous position allowed them to rapidly attack the oncoming Americans, which saw 4 Hellcats shot down. Regardless, US fighters continued to hound the forward group. As Iwamoto attempted to stop them, something began to feel off with his Zero's engine.
敵機が5機か10機なら、それほど怖くないかもしれないが、エンジン故障は制御不能だった。周囲は海で、もしここに不時着したら、救助の手段はないだろう。
Noticing that no enemies were pursuing the damaged fighter, Tetsuzō lowered the nose and headed for the shoreline.
高度 1000m まで降りた途端、突然エンジンがかかり始めました。汗だくになりました。こんな経験は初めてだったので、少し不安になりましたが、すぐにほっとしました。
Regaining altitude and attempting to get back into the engagement up ahead, the situation for the 316th 8th pilot didn't seem to improve.
高度 5000m に達した頃、再び大きなイオンが鳴り始め、以前よりもさらにひどい状態になりました。仕方なく引き返し、高元中にエンジンの状態を確認しました。しかし、高度 100m まで高元すると、エンジンは正常に戻りました。この状況では、戦闘は不可能だと判断しました。
Accompanied by the rest of his squadron, they withdrew back to Tainan. At 1:30 p.m., the other friendly fighters returned, though with the sad news that the 317th commander had been shot down by enemy planes in intense fighting where they had become separated from the main attack force. The Americans by this stage of the war were using radar to detect the incoming forces, allowing them to send out attack aircraft to ambush the Japanese some 100 kilometers ahead of the main task force. With the weather adding to the misery of the attempted attack, morale was severely lacking that afternoon. At 4 p.m, a B-25 approached from inland China, however attempts to intercept were futile given the bomber's altitude and speed. 20th of October 1944, the US 6th Army land at Leyte in the Philippines. For the 316th Kokutai, attention switches from Taiwan to the Gulf. Unfortunately for Iwamoto, he and several other crew members are struck down with malaria and dengue fever once again, which forces them to miss the initial departure of the unit that commences on the 22nd. In preparation for the combined Army and Navy aerial arrival in the Philippines, the remaining Japanese troops proceed to advance on Clark Field. Out at sea, the flagship of the task force, the aircraft carrier Zukaku, is accompanied by several smaller, converted carriers in that of Issa, Hyuga, as well as Yamashiro and Fuso. However, reconnaissance reports had revealed that alongside US Task Force 58, the enemy also had a new group of carriers in the sea to the east, near Luzon. That evening, a telegram reaches Iwamoto informing them that all aircraft successfully arrived at Clark Field. At dawn on the 25th of October 1944, 500 Japanese aircraft took off, heading straight for the US task force in the Philippines. The huge mass of incoming aircraft was immediately picked up by American radar, as once again US fighters could easily be sent out miles ahead of the carriers to intercept the attackers. The result was to be expected, as the bad news reached Tetsuzō, who still lay recovering back in Taiwan.
連合軍司令官は一撃で撃墜され、そして我が軍の勇敢な努力にもかかわらず、我が軍は壊滅的な敗北を喫した。
To add to the combined misery, the 25th of October would also mark the end of service for the Zukaku, as she is struck by 7 torpedoes and 9 bombs in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The order to abandon ship is given at 1:58 p.m. before the carrier rolls over and sinks stern first some 16 minutes later, taking with her the lives of Rear Admiral Kaizuka Takeo and 842 crewmen. She was the last surviving Japanese carrier involved in the attack on Pearl Harbor, so landing such a significant blow could only further American morale. With their overseas air strength substantially diminished, Imperial High Command began opting for desperate tactics in the Kamikaze. Although already seen throughout the war by Japanese aircraft that faced no other alternative other than capture, special attack units were now being formed and prioritized back on the mainland in a last-ditch attempt to stop the American advance. On the 26th of October, just a day after the heavy defeat was relayed to him, Iwamoto recovers from his sickness and so took off as soon as he could, flying alone along the Chinese coast and reaching the airspace above Luzon. Upon landing, he was shocked to find that most of the available aircraft on the airfield had been destroyed.
レーテ島の戦いの結末はもはや時間の問題であり、自爆攻撃で終わることは明らかだった。神風特攻隊と特攻隊の必死の攻撃もその結末を変える可能性は低かった。
A series of solo sorties followed as Tetsuzō launched gun-run attacks on American airfields from dawn till dusk. Dodging anti-aircraft fire and expelling all their ammunition, damage was most certainly being dealt. However, the Americans had so many aircraft available that those taken out of action were easily replenished the following day. With supplies reaching them from the mainland being out of the question, it was decided that Iwamoto and 4 other crew members would leave at midnight aboard a Douglas C-47 and make the trip overnight. After their arrival, the squadron rushed straight to Kanoa Air Base HQ, but to little avail as no supply equipment could be made available. Their next stop was Kasanohara Air Base, roughly 20 kilometers away. The commander there gave the okay for Tetsuzō to take the 9 aircraft they had available, despite the base's existing wait for resupply themselves. Flight tests were conducted and preparations for departure the following day were made. However, a call from Kanoa HQ halted their plan as an order came through for all 9 aircraft to be bomb-laden and transported to the 201st Air Group Special Attack Unit, somewhere that held no connection to the task at hand. Iwamoto was not impressed by this.
私は激怒し、指揮系統の異なる本部からの命令など聞くべきではない。笠原から受け取った装備は空輸すると言い返し、電話を切った。
The next morning, the squadron observed the arrival of the staff officer Tetsuzō had cut off during their heated call. He declared that all aircraft that had been accepted were to be taken away. Iwamoto saw no need to argue with, as he put it in his own words, such an idiot. Instead, he contacted the commander of the 252nd Kokutai asking for further instructions. A return message came in stating that they would be picked up by a C-47 the following morning, but at the same time another call came in from Kanoa again, reinstating their previous order that their squadron must airlift the aircraft the following day also. With a plan to stall for time, the Tiger of Rabaul ordered his men not to inform the base that a transport plane would be coming. The next morning, the Douglas set off from Tateyama at 4 a.m, scheduled to arrive at Kasanohara at 10. Yet at 8 a.m, a car arrived from Kanoa to pick up the squadron, as a bomber was already being prepared for their arrival. Telling the driver to come back later to pick them up at noon, the fighter squadron headed for their real destination on the airfield.
ダグラス号は帝国より30分早く到着した。私は急いで乗り込み、笠原を出発した。さようなら、あの愚かな参謀。
Upon arrival that afternoon back at Tateyama, he found his old acquaintance, Lieutenant Colonel Yagi, who was now in command. Reporting his return to the commander, Tetsuzō was told to stay for the time being and supervise the crew members currently undergoing formation training.
毎日、朝から晩まで厳しい訓練に明け暮れ、飛行機で若者たちと一緒に飛ぶのは、実戦より体力的にも疲れますが、夜は第200やソイチ航空隊時代から通い続けているお気に入りのレストランで、毎晩心を洗っています。
Christmas Day 1944 brought with it further transfer orders, with Colonel Yagi now being sent to the front line, leaving Iwamoto to join the newly formed 311th Squadron over in Mobara. Back in the Philippines, the remaining air force is lost to kamikaze and enemy attacks, as those surviving against the onslaught of the Allied advance simply had no planes left to fly. Captain Haruta was also killed in action while fighting the enemy that had attacked the Clark area. On the 9th of January 1945, S-Day, the US 6th Army, led by General Douglas MacArthur, landed at Lingayen Gulf near Manila, as the entirety of the Philippines were now under Allied control. In early February, a unit of 30 A6M2s arrived at the airfield. This was to make up the primary bulk of the 311th, which had originally been formed to fill in the gap left by the 281st. Led by former squadron leader of the fleet, Major Okajima, they were heading for southern Kyushu, with American task forces now attacking Shikoku, Chugoku, and Okinawa. Departure was planned for mid-February, so the night before the morning flight, all crew members went to Takeda restaurant for a farewell party. With most members returning to base at 11 p.m, Iwamoto stayed behind and continued drinking, not returning until 3 a.m. Falling asleep in his flight suit in the command post on the airfield, the Tiger would awaken at dawn the following morning to the sound of propellers and gunfire. Seeing only 8 of the 36 total Zeros at the airfield, Tetsuzō hopped into one and took off, climbing rapidly, the convoy of aircraft following closely behind. Observing a swarm of F-4U Corsairs attacking the area of the command post, the ace merged with additional enemies just below the clouds, firing as he went. Looking to withdraw, he was suddenly set upon by a quick barrage of fire from behind, with the enemy F-4U narrowly missing the kill shot. Naturally, it had been some time since Iwamoto had last engaged in aerial combat with another enemy fighter. Combined with still being half drunk from the night before, he was once again very lucky to be alive.
その瞬間、私は元から来た最初の飛行機を上空から攻撃し、かなり難しい軌道で、かろうじて効果的な射撃をいくつか命中させることができた。
His shots had hit their mark though, as the tank of the Corsair began to trail white smoke. As his first target headed back out to sea, Tetsuzō set his sights on another, this time striking it successfully as the enemy aircraft turned into a blazing fireball below. Noticing the increasingly low cloud cover at 500 meters, the squadron planned to use them for a surprise attack against more of the incoming Americans. Spotting a further 40 enemy bombers and fighters circling at low altitude, Iwamoto stalked his next target over the sea.
私は雲のすぐ元にいた敵に忍び寄り、奇襲攻撃を仕掛けた。最初の一撃で FCU の尾翼が折れ、頭から墜落した。私は雲の中へと上昇を続けようとしたが、同じく FCU を狙っていた2機目の機体が一撃で撃墜した。
With enemies in the area becoming aware of the squadron's presence, most proceeded to retreat to the safety of their allies below. En route back to the airfield, more US fighters were spotted above, up in the clouds. As both sets of fighters reached Mobara town, the Americans dived down, firing as both sides reached the airfield. An 8 versus 8 battle ensued.
有利な位置から攻撃していたため、私は2機を撃墜し、続いて3機を撃墜し、敵機は3機のみとなりました。敵機は果敢に反撃を続け、高度500から300メートルの低空で反撃を続けました。まず必死に車線を避けようとする戦闘機に追いつくため、急旋回を行い、飛行場の松林の中へと撃墜しました。 これを見た残りの2機は空中戦を諦めたのか、優れた速度を生かして逃走を図りました。彼らは航空支援体制についていた第2小隊に追撃され、ついに撃墜されました。8対8の空中戦で敵機は完全に殲滅し、味方機は1機も失われませんでした。
Of the 36 total aircraft available from the day before, 8 had been shot down, 4 had committed suicide, 2 had bailed, with 4 more having just completed maintenance. The squadron's total strength was reduced to 26. Further patrols took place over the next few days as the Americans continued their inland bombing campaign. On the 18th of February 1945, the 311th received a telegram from the garrison stationed on Iwajima.
大部隊が来襲中、大艦隊が入港中、硫黄島駐屯の航空部隊が全力で迎撃中。
At 8 a.m., a further report came in, this one more tragic than the last.
硫黄島の戦闘機は全て壊滅し、第2着衣阻止航空隊の日野が2分、総破敵の巡洋艦を爆破して沈没させ、自殺した。
The following day, on the 19th of February, US amphibious forces landed on Iwo taking heavy losses on the beaches against General Tadamichi Kobayashi's well-hidden defensive forces. 2 days later, on the 21st, the USS Bismarck C is fatally struck by 2 kamikaze strikes, sending her to the bottom alongside 318 US Navymen. Led by the 601st Kokutai operating out of Katori, they also caused heavy damage to the USS Saratoga, the destroyers USS Blessman and Gamble, along with the net cargo ship Keokuk and several landing craft. In comparison, however, these were little more than scratches compared to the total American might of ships, aircraft and men on the ground in the Pacific. February 28, 1945. The 311th Kokutai are ordered to advance to No. 1 Kokupu airfield. Iwamoto temporarily separates from the main force as his squadron head inland to Lake Kasumigara to conduct further test flights of Zeros sent by the Nakajima factory. March 12, 1945. 12 days later, now with 6 additional aircraft, Tetsuzō and his squadron also depart to Kokupu airfield in Kyushu, where the 701st Kokutai had taken charge. March 15th, Lieutenant Commander Okujima, now commander of the 1st Company of the 303rd Air Group, requests for Iwamoto's transfer. That same day, Tetsuzō hands in his transfer request to join the 303rd, immediately packing his belongings and boarding a 2-seater fighter plane, which arrives at the airfield in Kagoshima City that same evening. March 19th, 1945. American Task Force 58, appearing off the coast of Shikoku, launches strikes against Honshu and shipping in Kure Harbor. In response, one of their aircraft carriers, the USS Franklin, is hit by 2 bombs dropped by a Japanese Susi bomber from the 5th Air Fleet. Losing 807 of her crew and crippled, the carrier is written off by the Japanese as being sunk, but the USS Franklin would limp on to become the most heavily damaged US aircraft carrier to survive the war. March 24th, 1945. Japanese recon aircraft spot further enemy activity, including another carrier off the islands of Ishigaki and Daito. That evening, Tetsuzō takes the crew of the 303rd out for drinks, where he gives a toast, assuming that this would be their last.
隊員を帰らせた後、酒を飲んでいるのは私一人だけになってしまった。午後11時過ぎ、部隊から急いで戻るようにと電話がかかってきた。空腹のまま飲んだ酒が全身に染み渡り、かなり酔っていた。迎えの車で司令部に到着すると、司令官、参謀、飛行隊長をはじめ、第3百造航空隊の要人たちが入り口で待っていた。何かあったなと思いながら、よろめきながら車から降りた。車の揺れで目が回り、立っているのもやっとだった。参謀は不機嫌そうにしていた。
According to the flight commander, recon had been intensified around the area of Okinawa since that evening, but all of their reconnaissance aircraft had since been destroyed by enemy fighters, with not a single one returning. Reports from other units indicated that there had been a large buildup of enemy ships just south of Okinawa's main island, but rather than risk the destruction of further recon teams, the job of the nighttime reconnaissance would fall to the 303rd, specifically Iwamoto.
私は10年以上戦闘機を操縦しているので、 夜間単独飛行は特に難しいことではありません。それに酔っ払って任務を遂行できないような人間でもありません。酔っ払って足がフラフラしている私を見て指揮官は心配そうに言いました。指揮官、大丈夫です。任務は必ず完遂しますのでご安心ください。
Helped into his flight suit and carried to the awaiting aircraft at the airfield, Tetsuzō set off into the night sky above. It was a clear night, and after climbing to 3,000 meters, he set off on the plotted course for Okinawa.
離陸から30分後、左手に見える黒い物体は屋久島だったはずだ。その向こうにいくつかの島が見えた。高度を4000メートルまで上げ、受信機をオンにした。かすかに敵の通信らしきものが聞こえた。英語が聞こえた。
An hour later, near Amami Ashima, at an altitude of 6,000 meters, Iwamoto is picked up by American radar. With his drunkenness slowly wearing off, he decides to climb further up to 8,000 meters in an attempt to avoid any potential incoming aircraft, but he's too late. Several hundred meters behind him sits an American intercept fighter. Sensing an incoming threat, the ace dives for Lejima below. Maintaining course towards the enemy signal, he reaches the main island of Okinawa, but observes nothing out of the ordinary. Continuing further on to an area overlooking the Karama Islands, he spots US landing craft carrying supplies from ship to shore. Informing HQ of his findings via a coded message on radio, he receives back confirmation before heading in for a gun run on the unsuspecting boats in the darkness below. Several passes causes a few boats to catch fire before the defensive gunfire starts up on his position. With the flames erupting and chaos ensuing for those on the ground, Iwamoto took his leave, remaining low at 500 meters and returning to base unscathed some 2 hours later. The following day, on March 26th, brought with it the end of the Battle of Iwo Jima, as US Marines finally secure the island. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, over 18,000 are killed. The Americans don't fare any better, losing almost 7,000 men with 19,000 wounded. With this victory, the door to mainland Japan has been blown wide open by the Allies. On the same day, Operation Tenichigo was launched. Almost all of the Navy's Air Force in the 3rd, 5th and 10th carriers were deployed, with the 303rd Fighter Squadron being relied upon to escort the attacking force. Regardless of his physical state upon returning to the airfield the night prior, Iwamoto would lead 16 fighters into the fray as they approached Okinawa around 9 AM that morning. 60 aircraft, consisting of torpedo and heavy bombers, flew in formation at 4,000 meters, the escorts above them at 6,000. The Americans, however, were ready to meet them, as an all-out brawl begins in the skies above the main island. Spotting 20 enemy aircraft to his left, Tetsuzō raises his squadron's altitude to 7,000 meters before engaging the enemy.
有利な位置から敵 FCU に突撃し、最初の攻撃で1機を撃墜、さらに3機を護衛機に撃墜された。勢いに乗じて2回目の攻撃を試みたが失敗に終わった。混戦は避けるべきと判断し、護衛機に合図を送り、ケラマ諸島の外側で大きく右旋回して戦場から撤退した。
In contrast to the cutting-edge American fighters that favored speed and armor over maneuverability, the now outdated early Model Zeros were no match when it came to the much more drawn-out energy engagements. Returning to base safely, no aircraft under Iwamoto's wing were shot down. However, 10 of the 60 attack Air Force craft were lost during the battle, with 4 enemy fighter victories claimed. March 27th, 1945. Further Japanese attacks are launched against the US task force approaching Okinawa from dawn till dusk, but they fail to see any major results besides heavy damage to a single US cruiser. March 29th, all fighter groups in the vicinity of Tanegashima are ordered to provide kamikaze planes to help strengthen the air superiority unit. The 303rd, 311th, 307th and 308th oblige. However, the planned attack fails to find the US task force, and so all are returned to base. April 1st, 1945, the US finally launches Operation Iceberg, which sees the landing of 2 Marine divisions, 4 Army divisions and 1,500 surface ships on Okinawa. In retaliation, the Japanese deploy fierce consecutive attacks by kamikazes until the 3rd of April, inflicting heavy damage. April 6th, the 5th Air Fleet launches Operation Kikusui, another full-scale air attack on the Americans. April 13th, the first kamikaze attack from the mainland is launched. A huge 196-strong attack force participate, including 85 Zero fighter bombers, 20 D4Y Judy dive bombers, 15 B6N Jill torpedo bombers, 30 B5N Kates, and 46 Bals. They were to go after the ships around Okinawa. Repelling enemy fighters was top priority for this mission, as Iwamoto was selected to lead the protection escort. He would witness the results of these special attack units firsthand, as his unit would watch from above.
特攻隊員たちは次々と目標機に命中し、機体と共に爆発した。急行元中に炎上する機体もあれば、目標を外して海に墜落する機体もあった。ほんの少し前までは私たちと同じように片手で操縦桿、もう片手でスロットルを操作して飛行していたのに、今や彼らの体も心も機体と共に吹き飛ばされてしまったのだ。身の毛もよだつ思いだ。
With their human payloads delivered, the remaining Zeros began their attack runs on the nearby Hellcat fighters, using their high altitude to zoom in and blast the Americans out of the sky. Tetsuzō claimed 3 kills in 3 hits in these engagements against the F-6Fs, putting those 20mm cannons to work. Taking a cautious approach not to run into any ambushes on the route back, the unit arrives back to base 2.5 hours later. In all, 16 enemy aircraft were claimed as shot down, with the loss of 3 fighters, not counting the 200 or so that disappeared in the waters of Okinawa that day. The same attack would be made the following day, however the force available would be much smaller in comparison. Tetsuzō would once again command the protection of some 60 special attack aircraft, whose final moments he wasn't able to observe due to approaching enemies and heavy cloud cover. Several days prior, on the morning of the 6th of April, the pride of the combined fleet, the super battleship Yamato, along with her Agano-class cruiser escort, Yahagi, and 8 destroyers were passing through the Osumi Strait, heading south at 210 degrees at a speed of 24 knots. Captained by Kosaku Aruga, they had received orders for Operation Tengo as they sped towards Okinawa. In combination with the special attack unit threat from the air, the Yamato was tasked with bombarding the enemy's landing site with their large guns. However, after returning from their initial escort duties that day, the 303rd Fighter Squadron received news from the Yamato that 40 to 50 enemy carrier-based aircraft were attacking. Because of the prerogative of advancing on the enemy with the main air superiority force, she had been left with minimal air cover by only a small number of spare aircraft. Rushing at full speed some 100 kilometers to Cape Bono, Iwamoto's squadron arrived at the scene, but the Yamato was nowhere to be seen. Her sister ship, the Musashi, had been sunk some 6 months earlier during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, as now it was the 72,000-ton flagship's turn to head to the depths. In the place where she sank was a swarm of F-4U Corsairs. The Americans, consisting of aircraft from CV-12 of the USS Hornet and CV-20 of the USS Bennington, by this point were drunk with victory, and so did not expect an incoming attack. This would be the revenge of the Yamato.
パニックに陥った敵機は次々と海に墜落していった。これは戦艦ヤマトにとって最高の慰霊碑となった。この時、私は沈みゆくヤマトに3機の FCU を捧げた。
On the 12th of April 1945, the 303rd continued their escort support for a further 80 Special Attack Force aircraft, including the Oka squadron of the Shinrai Force. As the Kamikaze pilots entered the combat area, Tetsuzō once again engaged enemy fighters, claiming 2 F-6Fs and strafing aircraft on the ground at Nojima. 3 days later, on the 15th, this time under the command of Okajima, an intense aerial battle broke out over Okinerabu Island, with the commander himself firing the first shots.
上空の雲のおかげで戦闘中ずっと有利な位置から攻撃を続け、敵機30機近くを撃墜しました。その後、後方から接近する敵機と交戦し、私は単独で F6F 式を撃墜しました。空中戦は約20分間続き、これは我々にとって史上最長の戦闘でした。時宜を得て、我々の飛行隊は雲間から抜け出し、戦場を離脱しました。途中で指揮官の中隊と合流し、 無事に基地へ帰還しました。
4 days later, on the 16th, Iwamoto would witness the new 343rd Kokutai in action for the first time over Kagoshima. Having already shot down an F-6F that day, he returned en route towards Kokubu Air Base, spotting further Hellcats and TBF Avengers below. By the looks of things, they had just finished an attack run, and so were lowering their altitude to reach the surface of the sea.
ふと、鹿児島湾の上空を見上げると、高度 1000m を旋回する敵機が70機か80機、目を凝らすと雲間から次々と黒い弾丸が降り注ぎ、敵機を攻撃しているのが見えた。敵機は次々と海面に墜落し、水しぶきを上げていた。どの部隊のものかは分からなかったが、息を飲むほど壮観な攻撃だった。近づいてみると、味方機は敵機のグラマン機とおり2つだった。これは松山花王村の試練隊に違いないと思った。
The 343rd had been patrolling over Kyushu at 10,000 meters that day before receiving word of the enemy's attack below. Having taken off from the USS Langley that morning, US F-6F Hellcats of the CV-27 were conducting fighter sweeps across Kanoya and Kagoshima before colliding with the N1K2 Shidenkais of Captain Gendai's air group. Tetsuzō had joined in the pursuit of the enemy, but they quickly fled. Before he knew it, the Shidenkais had already disappeared too. A week and a half later, on the 28th of April 1945, and the prospect of engaging American bombers via suicidal tactics began to increase, given that the 303rd had so far failed to take down a single B-29 in its defense of the mainland. With reports coming in of an enemy formation heading for Tanegashima, Iwamoto jumped into his A6M5C Model 0 and took off after 8 AM. Climbing to 2,000 meters, he observed the airfield below, noticing that no other aircraft had yet taken off. Unknown to Tetsuzō at the time due to the broken receiver, the mission had been cancelled due to supposed misidentification of the enemy planes as friendly. Regardless, he pushed on, alone.
高度 9000m で酸素補給を受けながら鹿屋と鹿児島の間を巡回しました。高度 9000m に到達するのは容易ではありません。地上では春の真っ盛りですが、この高度では厳しい寒さがフライトスーツを突き刺します。飛行機の性能も低もとし、頭の回転もなまり始めます。
Half an hour after takeoff, he spots something sparkling in the sun beyond the peninsula. Cautiously approaching, the object becomes clearer and it is confirmed to be a B-29 Superfortress cruising at full speed around 5,000 meters, an altitude surprisingly low for an infamous aircraft. Tetsuzō radios in that he's made contact and rushes forward towards the enemy formation. With the lead aircraft in his sights and with an altitude advantage of 4,000 meters, he sends another message stating his intention to attack before pushing his engine to full throttle and launching into an inverted vertical dive.
敵編隊から撃ち込まれた銃弾の雨あられは辺り一面を真っ赤に染めた。敵の戦闘機の巨大な機種がまさに視界の中央にあった。焦りを抑え、私はさらに接近し、必ず野蛮化しようと決意した頭義を得た攻撃だった。7.7ミリ機銃と20ミリ機銃を全て網にかけようとした。ほんの1、2秒だったが、あまりにも近すぎた。身を隠すには遅すぎた。ああ、ぶつかった突然、体が粉々に砕け散るのを感じたが、目を閉じ、手足を力いっぱい伸ばした。ものすごい衝撃が走り、辺りが真っ暗になった。何時だったかわからないが、気がつくと機体は回転しながら地面に向かって落語としていた。急いで渾身の力で操縦桿を引いて、やっと高度 2000m のところで機体を引き上げることができた。操縦桿が右に傾いていたため確認すると、右翼の外側が日の丸の3分の1ほど剥がれ落ちていました。それから紙切れのように剥がれたジュラルミンの破片に気づき、ようやく状況を理解しました。右元、高度約 2000m で B-29 が黒煙を吐きながらよろめいているのが見えました。
Following the enemy bomber down, Iwamoto observes the aircraft dropping to just above the water level before finally making an emergency landing outside Shibushi Bay. As soon as it landed in the water, 4 of the crew were seen escaping the aircraft as a nearby patrol boat was heading towards the scene at full speed. The bomber remained floating on the surface for some time before its tail raised and sank into the sea below.
私の最後の一撃はそれまで撃墜できなかった B-29 をついに撃破した。
With his wingtip sliced off, Tetsuzō made an emergency landing at Myakonojo Army Airfield just north of the bay. Temporary repairs were made by the ground crews on Iwamoto's request, while observers at the airfield told him of how they watched his attack from start to finish, thinking he'd rammed the enemy perfectly. With minor repairs completed by 3 p.m, the ace took off once more, wobbling his way back to Kagoshima Air Base. Interestingly, US records indicate that those operating on the 28th were a total of 111 B-29s, whose task it was to hit airfields at Kushira, Kanoya, Myakonojo, Miyazaki, and Izumi. 5 B-29s were lost, however the exact details of each aren't specified besides the group and casualties. For that day in April, the most likely candidate Iwamoto shot down was from the 499th Bombardment Group, where all 11 crew members were reported as missing in action, which matches given that neither Tetsuzō nor the other B-29s reported seeing the deployment of parachutes as the aircraft went down. The fact that it successfully performed an emergency landing confirms that at least 4 of the crew made it out alive, but exact numbers are not confirmed either. Regardless, Iwamoto was credited as single-handedly shooting down a B-29, a feat that would only be matched by a handful of other Japanese pilots, the most notable at that time being 12-kill ace of the 244th Sentai, Major Terahiko Kobayashi. Tetsuzō's final frontline combat mission would take place escorting a further 50 kamikaze aircraft against US ships over Okinawa. A furball ensued against defending F-4U Corsairs, however the odds were extremely unfavorable for the attackers, so he quickly retreated from the battlefield. The kamikazes slipped through the cracks of battle, plunging below and damaging 7 enemy destroyers. The USS Benion, Butler, England, Ralph Talbot, Rathburn, Twiggs, and Wadsworth all received hits, however none were sunk. Escorted by his 3 wingmen, Iwamoto's squadron headed back to base. En route, they were bounced by 8 Corsairs. Attempting to flee, they quickly realized that the F-4U's superior speed would render this solution futile as the enemy crept within 100 meters of their 6 o'clock.
敵は数と速度の優位性を頼りに攻撃を仕掛けてきた。私も胴体と翼に数十発の被弾を受けたが、肝心な部位を外れたため難を逃れた。しかし、状況はますます不利になり、逃げて撃墜されるよりは、敵機に体当たりを仕掛けるしかないと判断した。そこで、上空と後方から攻撃してくる敵機に追いつき、急上昇で元方から反撃し、敵機を撃ち抜いた。
Miraculously, his strategy worked as the 20mm bullets ripped through the belly of the Corsair, sending it crashing into the sea below. Encouraged, he aimed to ram the other F-4U as it charged towards him from above in a head-on pass. Both aircraft missed each other as Iwamoto pointed his nose down, firing madly at another enemy beneath him. His shots hit their mark as yet another American fighter hit the deck in flames. The 4th aircraft retreated as Tetsuzō's rampage against his attackers led him to blindly follow in pursuit. Not noticing he'd picked up another tail, his Zero received another peppering of bullets as the windshield shattered and his right wing tank erupted, causing gasoline to spray out like white smoke.
これで終わりだと思ったが、エンジンはまだスムーズに動いていた。
Forcing an overshoot, Iwamoto continued firing on the enemy Corsair. The Americans simply pointed their nose back towards Okinawa and took off. The ordeal saw the loss of 1 Japanese wingman as his other 2 were soon spotted flying just above the water below. Regaining his composure, Tetsuzō gained altitude before heading back towards base.
被害状況を確認すると、座席の後ろは穴だらけで、右翼にも蜂の巣がいくつもできていた。右タンクのガソリンは切れたようで、白煙は出ていなかった。座席の両側の軽基板は完全に破壊され、電信機には足がいるほどの大きな穴が開いていた。体に何も当たっていないと思っていたのに、自分の不運に愕然とした。
This engagement marked the second occasion Iwamoto had almost been killed in action at the hands of F-4U pilots, as his recklessness in combat both cost and saved him dearly. With his aircraft limping back to base at Tanegashima, he is forced to glide the Zero in as the engine cuts out just before reaching the runway. Yet again, he is lucky to be alive. 11th of May 1945. Operation Kikusui No. 6 is launched as more kamikaze aircraft are launched against US ships over Okinawa. 2 strikes hit the USS Bunker Hill, who is severely damaged but remains aloft despite losing almost 400 of her crew. She limps back to the US, remaining there in repairs until the end of the war. 13th of June. The 5th Air Fleet is forced to create a new unit for the training of replacement crews, with 1 experienced member chosen from each existing squadron. Persuaded by Okajima, Iwamoto is chosen and transferred despite his reluctance to serve in a rear line unit. Eventually arriving at Iwakunai Air Base, training work begins from the 15th. 22nd of June, the Battle of Okinawa comes to an end, as Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ishijima and General Cho commit seppuku in front of their remaining senior officers. As one of the bloodiest engagements of the Pacific War, the Japanese lose an estimated 100,000 men, including some 150,000 civilians. The Americans suffer 45,000 casualties, with 12,500 killed in action. With Okinawa now in enemy hands, the remaining Japanese airmen are withdrawn to bases at Kita-Kyushu and Shikoku. By mid-July, the order is given to organize all existing air squadrons into kamikaze units, with Iwamoto's altered to a tactical system in the event of an enemy mainland invasion. This new system would see all young pilots assigned to kamikaze attacks, while veteran pilots would be assigned to gun and bomber squadrons. Towards the end of that month, training was complete, with all units transferred to the Kyushu region. Only the instructors, Tetsuzō included, remained at Iwakunai Air Base. 6th of August 1945, the first of the atomic bombs, Little Boy, a uranium-based weapon, is dropped on Hiroshima, causing 135,000 civilian casualties, killing over 60,000 in an instant. 3 days later, on the 9th, the plutonium core implosion-type nuclear bomb, Fat Man, is dropped on Nagasaki, resulting in a further 60,000 casualties, with 39,000 obliterated. 15th of August 1945. At noon, the imperial rescript on surrender is issued, with Emperor Hirohito himself announcing via radio Japan's immediate and unconditional surrender. The 5th Air Fleet, however, has other ideas and orders the continuation of operations. At Iwakunai, all available aircraft are pushed out onto the airfield, awaiting the potential final battle with the enemy. This fight will never come though, as the eventual ceasefire order is issued. Vice Admiral Ugaki Matome, commander of the Air Fleet, shows one final act of defiance as he sends a farewell message to each of his subordinate units before stripping his uniform of all insignias and boarding one of 11 duty bombers to launch one final suicide attack on the enemy fleet at Okinawa. These aircraft don't even make it to the US task force, as American night fighters intercept and shoot down all aircraft. Igaki's plane goes down on the beach of Ihejima Island, where his body is identified the following morning. For Iwamoto, his time in the Navy was over. There was no final glorious battle, no end heroics, the war was just over.
岩国基地で3日間を過ごしたが、何もすることがなく、まるでかつての自分とはかけ離れた空っぽの殻のような気分だった。こうして、戦闘機パイロットとしての10年場のキャリアは、幕を閉じた。
Cautious of further kamikaze attacks by loyalist aviators, the Americans order all aircraft on every airfield across mainland Japan to be disarmed and disassembled. Aside from a few souvenirs like the J-7W Shinden and N-1K2 fighter, all aircraft, regardless of type or condition, have their armament and propellers removed, ready for the arrival of American occupational forces. Isolated test flights are carried out for data analysis of certain fighter types before all Japanese planes are scrapped together, being crushed and burned. Promoted to sub-lieutenant on his enforced retirement from the Japanese Navy after their surrender, Iwamoto is called upon twice by the Supreme Command of the Allied forces that now occupied the mainland, led by General Douglas MacArthur. Put under interrogation and investigated, Iwamoto was eventually cleared of any charges pertaining to war crimes. However, during this time, given his record in the Navy, he was blacklisted from most public sector employment, which in turn saw his attempts at being hired by local factories and companies near impossible. Returning home, he eventually joined the Japan Pioneering Corporation before Tetsuzō fell in love with a woman who he soon married. Oddly, it was 3 days after the wedding that he left for a pioneering group in Hokkaido, but due to illness returned a year and a half later, having said to his wife upon seeing her that he'd forgotten what her face looked like. Post-war was incredibly tough for Iwamoto, and due to the rapidly changing Japan around him, he struggled to adapt, suffering from depression despite finding temporary work here and there in civil engineering, farming, poultry, and catering. Heavy alcohol use became commonplace, just as it had been during the war, but as the San Francisco Peace Treaty was signed by Japan on September 8, 1951, followed by the eventual withdrawal of occupied forces in 1952, he was finally able to secure full-time employment at a spinning mill. It seemed the ace's luck had finally run out, however, as in the summer of 1953, he fell severely ill with intense stomach pain and had to undergo surgery. Misdiagnosed as enteritis, Tetsuzō complained of lower back pains shortly after, where the cause, appendicitis, would ultimately be discovered too late. With his doctors thinking the enteritis had caused some form of infection, his final surgery saw the removal of 4 ribs without anesthesia, which in turn led to the development of sepsis. From his hospital bed, the former pilot's last words to his wife were reported as being, "When I get well, I want to fly again." Tetsuzō Iwamoto died on the 20th of May 1955 in Matsuda, Japan, aged just 38, survived by his wife and 2 children. Despite the known successes of other more publicized Japanese aces like Saburo Sakai and Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Tetsuzō Iwamoto remains relatively obscured from Western audiences despite being decorated as one of the top Japanese aces of the war. His untimely demise meant he simply wasn't around long enough to provide further details regarding his time in the Navy. It wouldn't be until after his death that Iwamoto's diaries were discovered by his wife, who kept possession of them before their initial publication in 1972. Consisting of 3 large notebooks filled with his recollections from the Sino-Japanese War right through to the end of World War II, they were written with the eventual intention of bringing them together into a later, single manuscript. His personal records detail a total of 202 aerial victories, which includes 26 shared kills. However, modern academics often credit him with a total figure that actually sits somewhere between 80 and 94. Through my own time and research in reading Tetsuzō's words, he always struck me as someone who, like most eager men at that time, got swept up in the opportunity of Japan's rapid expansion in order to make something more of his life. He held no intention of remaining at home in the family business, and as the youngest of 3 sons, there always remained this feeling of having something to prove. His early successes in China and the Coral Sea brought respect to his strategies in facing any given battle, something his commanders would often seek counsel of on the eve of an engagement. Despite this, Iwamoto never saw himself as the intended leader, a role he doubted even when given to train new pilots.
実戦経験しかないので操縦技術は未熟で模範となるようなパイロットにはなれません。編隊飛行中も常に緊張し隣の木にぶつかりそうになります。これでは良いリーダーとは言えません。しかし彼らは間もなく最前線へと向かうパイロットたちです。私も命がけで彼らを訓練しなければなりません。
As the war pressed on and the fatigue of constantly risking his life became a daily occurrence, the charismatic, sometimes brash fighter pilot became worn down by the state of his country's leadership and decision-making. Seeing the demise of both country and comrade in front of him, while observing the propagated lies being told back home on the progress of the war itself, left him disheartened, a feeling that was only exacerbated upon the introduction of the special attack units.
この戦術が軍全体に広まると、兵士たちの士気は目に見えて引くもとし始めた。私は神ではない。兵士たちが生きる道を見つけて初めて士気は高まるのだ。表向きは皆明るいふりをしていたが、内心では悲鳴を上げていた。衰退の一途をたどる戦争に本当にそこまで手を尽くす必要があったのだろうか。勝ち目のない軍事令部による最後の手段に過ぎないと私には思えた。
Each moment in his wartime career saw his victories rise only for his nations to fall. Witnessing countless deaths around him in the skies of battle, many of which he could do nothing about, plagued his mind and fueled his drinking habits, something that would usually help, for better or worse, in bringing out how he truly felt. In the autumn of 1944, Tetsuzō started to make visits to a restaurant near the Mobara base in Chiba Prefecture. The second daughter of the restaurant's owner, Ichiko, often met Iwamoto, where she claimed he didn't like pictures.
彼は写真を撮られるのは嫌だと言っていました。とにかく生き残りたいと言っていました。私も彼の写真を撮りたかったのですが、彼は誰かに写真を撮られたら魂が引き抜かれてしまうと言いました。若くして死にたくないので写真を撮られるのは嫌なのです。誰かに写真を撮られるたびに私の魂は縮んでしまうのです。
Given his regular observations of America's incoming firepower firsthand, deep down Iwamoto was always aware of the futility of Japan's situation, as 1945 only stoked his questioning of those in command. His knowledge and experience in the air must have felt like both a blessing and a curse, as attempts at mounting some kind of attack or patrol against overwhelming odds just seemed like an increasingly pointless risk of life to the ace.
飛行隊長はいつもの大胆さで、直ちに我が飛行隊を茂原とカトリマの哨戒に派遣した馬鹿げた考えだった。数百機の敵機が攻撃してくるのに、たった12機の飛行機を飛ばしても何の役にも立たない。戦力を温存し、日没前に攻撃に備える方がどれだけ効果的かは不明だった。
His love for the A6M-0 and its subsequent variants was most apparent throughout the war, even when Tetsuzō himself was fully aware of its shortcomings against American opposition. His career saw him serve with several other aces, the most prominent being Soichi Sugita and Takeo Tanimizu, as all three would see action together in Rabaul. Tanimizu would go on to survive the war, credited with 18 aerial victories, who subsequently passed away at the age of 92 in 2008. Sugita was shot down during an attempted takeoff against F-6F Hellcats while serving with the Shidenkai Squadron of the 343rd in Kanoya on the 15th of April 1945. While his skills in the air were of the highest caliber, one can't help but touch on the element of Tetsuzō's luck during the course of the war. His postings, illnesses, decisions, and overall timing led him through to survival, be it with an eventual unfortunate end in the post-war years. Like many veterans, his recollections show the dichotomy of his younger, almost superior self to the quiet, subdued man he had become. Behind those eyes sits the soul of the zero-fighting tiger, a man whose loyalty and sacrifice stemmed from those around him, even as the weariness of battle soon turned advantage into the defense of his home. His sense of personal glory and principle in the way of Bushido are what drove his younger self. He was fueled by his own successes and the status that brought, but none of that meant anything once the truth was realized and he could see past the illusion his country was distilling over its people. Tetsuzō Iwamoto operated as any loyal subject of the Imperial Empire would, but underneath that facade sat a man who understood the situation of war and who simply wanted to survive.